Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast. Today we're going to look at the post-classical period in China as we sort of move away from Europe and towards East Asia. Specifically, what's going on here, though, rather like Byzantium, which considers itself a continuation of a classical legacy, something very similar is happening in China. But to go back to the classical period, you'll remember after the fall of the Han, there was a period of competing states. It wasn't so grim and gruesome as the warring states period before the classical period. However, there was no single state in control. At times, there were three large kingdoms, each trying to position itself to become an empire, but none actually got it done. Moreover, the idea of Confucianism is largely discredited. It was seen as the thing that was supposed to work and that did work so long for the Han Dynasty, but when the Han Dynasty falls, many people are starting to question the value of Confucianism. That is about the same time that Buddhism is introduced into East Asia, but it doesn't really get popular until after the fall of the Han Empire, excuse me. And again, the timing of this is kind of interesting because as everybody is worried not just about who's going to be in control and are we going to go back to a warring states period, but like is Confucianism really as valuable as we thought it was? And they're looking for something to cling to, and Buddhism provides that insofar as it claims to end suffering. But a question remains, which variety of Buddhism is the one that the Chinese are going to adopt, Theravada or Mahayana? In this chart, you'll see some of the differences that hopefully you remember from the classical period. Mahayana Buddhism worships the Buddha as a god, and several of the other differences are noted here. And if you remember, once Ashoka becomes a Buddhist and starts spreading Buddhism throughout Asia, as it starts spreading more and more, it's the Mahayana version that worships Buddha as a god that starts to spread, largely because of its ability to syncretically incorporate local gods as bodhisattvas. So in the end, it's the Mahayana version that will spread into East Asia. Eventually, though, what we see is the rise of the Sui dynasty. And if you notice the dates on here, you'll notice that it doesn't last particularly long. And it started by this dude, Sui Wendi, the Emperor Wen of Sui, who conquers the other kingdoms that are trying to vie for power by military force, and in so doing, then claims the mandate of heaven. In effect, what we've got going on here is a restarting of the dynastic cycle, which you'll remember, which is an underlying constant throughout Chinese political history. But one of the slight twists is Sui Wendi is actually a Buddhist. And so now you've got a Buddhist as the emperor. Nonetheless, what he does is he replicates what the Han Dynasty had done before him. The Confucian bureaucracy is put back in place. That includes the examination system, the notion that the scholars should be the government officials, even as he himself is a Buddhist. Something else to note, there's some similarities between the Sui dynasty and the Qin dynasty insofar as both were, military forces that just conquered the other kingdoms by military power, and neither of them lasted very long. However, the Sui dynasty does make some very long-lasting contributions. First, it starts to build this project called the Grand Canal, a system of canals that is going to open up transportation, and that's going to have very long and significant impacts throughout East Asia. And one of the ways that they do this is through corvée labor, which, if you remember, corvée system means that you pay your taxes in the form of labor. This was a technique, if you remember, Qin Shi Huangdi used to get the labor to build the Great Wall of China. This is a really fuzzy map, and I apologize for that, but it does illustrate how much activity is going on to build the Grand Canal, which connects initially, first of all, it connects Chang'an, which is now Xi'an, which was the capital city, to the Yellow River. But then it also connects the Yellow River to the Yangtze, and then even further down to a port that is in the south. And this is something that's going to be a recurring theme, that access to the southern seas. However, that dynasty is very, very short, and it is followed by the Tang dynasty, which, if you notice, lasts for about 300 years, a pretty significant chunk of time, who will then expand the boundaries pretty significantly into Central Asia. This particular image, you'll notice, juts out along the Silk Roads, but in fact, their influence is much, much larger than that. Because what's starting to develop is a particularly Chinese view of the tributary system, of tribute. Tribute is not new, but the way the Chinese practice it is very, very interesting. In theory, what China wants more than anything else is for everyone to acknowledge they are the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom. And so, in theory, the tribute is supposed to be an acknowledgement of the superiority of the Chinese. But in practice, what it actually ends up becoming is the Chinese are getting gifts from these conquered peoples, but they're giving back way more than the value of the gifts in terms of trade agreements, military security, etc. And so the theory is that this is reinforcing Chinese greatness, but if you look at it on a practical level, the people paying tribute to China are actually getting the better end of the deal. Their expansion into Central Asia continues so far until 751 in the Battle of Talas, a pretty interesting battle because it's with the Abbasids. The Abbasids, remember, the caliphate that's based out of Baghdad. The Tang dynasty is extended so far that they're actually bumping up against the Abbasid caliphate. In the end, the Abbasids will defeat the Tang armies there. They will not conquer, but that does sort of mark the fullest expansion of the Tang dynasty. In this map, what you see all around it is kind of an unusual perspective. All of the protectorates that are not officially part of the Tang Empire, but they are paying tribute to the Tang. And what you noticed is they're like, here's India down here. It extends all the way past the Indus River and into the Abbasid territory. Now, a bunch of this will get peeled off after the Battle of Talas, and the tensions between the Tang and these people that are so-called protectorates is going to be an issue that we'll see here in just a moment. But again, as big as the formal boundaries of the empire were, their actual influence was much larger. In terms of the role of Confucianism, though, the bureaucracy is expanded during the Tang Dynasty. There's even more government positions that scholars could hold if they pass the examination system, which during the Tang Dynasty becomes reformed. There's some aspects of corruption and questions about what are the texts that they're supposed to know that get changed. And in this time, then, a new type of Confucianism emerges that is frequently called Neo-Confucianism, New Confucianism. And specifically, what that's referring to is a kind of blending of Confucian ideas with Taoist and Buddhist ideas. And they all are sort of mixing together, and this is something we'll talk about more in class, the idea that there's these three teachings that can coexist, not just in society, but within people in general. Part of this is a reflection, though, that many of the Tang rulers were Buddhists, including the only empress that ever ruled in Chinese history, Wu, who she was a Buddhist, and she is building Buddhist temples all over China to try to promote Buddhism. Now, who doesn't like this? Well, the Confucian scholars don't like this idea, not only because it's promoting a religion that is not Confucianism, but also because they feel like that it's using money that was supposed to go for the public good to build or to further one particular religion. In terms of the culture of the Tang era, though, If the Han Dynasty was a political golden age, the Tang Dynasty was a cultural golden age. As I mentioned, the idea of the three teachings starts to emerge, and this is a pretty famous image here. On the left is Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism. On the right is Confucius, Kung Fu Tzu, and Confucius is holding a baby Buddha. And in point of fact, all three of them did live more or less simultaneously, but of course, there's no evidence that this was actually a thing. But it becomes a sort of cultural meme, if you will, the idea of all of these three living together. It's during the Tang dynasty that the three greatest poets in Chinese history all live at exactly the same time and knew each other. If we have time, we're going to get more into that in class. But besides just culture, there's other things that the Tang does exceedingly well, including establish a whole new legal code in 624. And the Tang legal code, as we'll see, will become sort of the basis for the laws throughout East Asia for a whole lot of time. It's also famous for reviving trade on the Silk Roads. After the fall of the Han Dynasty, when the Silk Roads really emerged for the first time as trans-regional trade routes connecting them to other parts of the world, they kind of fall away for a little bit in the absence of a strong empire. The Tangs are going to rekindle that, bringing with it the economic success, but also bringing in new cultural traditions from South Asia. But in terms of agricultural production, something interesting is happening here. A new variety of rice that comes from the part of Southeast Asia that's right next to China, what is now Vietnam, at the time it was called Champa, a new rice strain is introduced into China. And the thing about this particular rice strain that's interesting, first of all, it's really relatively drought resistant, so you can grow it even if you can't flood the fields, which you normally need to do to grow rice. But the biggest thing about it was you can harvest it twice in one season. So think about it. Just if you did nothing but replace all your rice with champa rice, you instantly have twice as much food because you can harvest two times instead of once. But you add that to the fact that terracing is now a really well refined technique. We'll look at pictures of this later on, but rice paddies, you need to flood them. And if you're building on hillsides, which there's quite a great deal of, you will need to build terraces to level those out. Otherwise, all the water is going to drain out. So the combination of this new variety of rice and new ways of growing it is going to lead to a huge population increase, doubling in the time of the Tang Dynasty. And remember, this was already one of the most heavily populated areas in the world to begin with. A consequence of this then is increased urbanization. The largest cities in the world, almost all are in China at this particular time. They're popping up all over the place. It also has the effect, though, of moving the center of power away from the northern part of China, north of the Yellow River, where it historically had been, and more down to the south, areas that now have the ability to feed a larger population that they may not have before. As great as things are during the Tang Dynasty, though, they got some problems. The first is overexpansion. Like their influence is so large, they're having a hard time keeping it together. Power struggles involving the succession of emperors, which over time that becomes an issue for most empires. But a big one that emerges is social inequality, and something interesting is going on here. The Han tried this briefly, something called the equal field system, where the state basically would give everybody the same amount of land to grow food. And the Tang actually tried to revive this as a way to combat a recurring problem called the scholar gentry problem. And you might remember this, I mentioned this in the Han Dynasty because it was a concern for them. The scholars are supposed to be at the top of the social hierarchy. They pass the examination, they become government officials. The gentry are the wealthy landowners. They're supposed to be the second class below the scholars. But what seems to happen periodically is you get certain families that become so wealthy that they just do nothing but train all of the boys in the family to do nothing but take the examination system, or take the examinations, pass it, move up the bureaucracy, until you get this combination of certain families that have all of the wealth of the gentry and all of the political power of the scholars. And so those things that are supposed to be two separate social classes in the sort of ideal of the Confucian social hierarchy become merged into one. And this has horrible consequences in terms of the society. The equal field system was an attempt to try to address that, although it doesn't address it very well. Another issue they have is in tax collection. The tax collectors are seen as more and more corrupt. Their burdens on peasants are getting higher and higher, whereas it's less and less on the gentry. All of this comes to a head in what's known as the An Lushan Rebellion. Now, this is a really complicated rebellion. The causes are really multifold, but the basic idea is this. A general, An Lushan, who has all sorts of resentments towards the Tang emperors, actually marches on the capital city and occupies it. And there's all sorts of reasons, and everybody's looking into this for different, to validate what they want. Peasants like it because they think it's a revolt against the taxation of the Tang dynasty. The people of Southern Asia like it because they think it's a revolt against the ethnic Hans. An Lushan, I think himself, if we look at it with a clear eye, he was just power hungry. He wanted to take over the empire. The causes may be complex, but the effect is pretty clear. It's going to serve to weaken the Tang dynasty, especially because the way the Tang dynasty is actually finally able to put down this rebellion is by contracting soldiers from Central Asia. In other words, they need to hire soldiers that aren't Chinese. The Tang army cannot put down the rebellion by itself. And so they are now relying on the soldiers of Central Asia that are supposed to be paying tribute to the Tang dynasty. So this starts a chain reaction that will eventually lead to a new dynasty claiming the mandate of heaven, the Song dynasty. Not so powerful militarily as the Tang were. For example, they're going to lose territory in the north to these people called the Jurchen, who form what's called the Jin dynasty. They don't take over China, but they assert their own dynasty in the northern part. Eventually, the Mongols are going to be the ones to conquer them, and they can't put up much of a resistance against them. But even as they're not so strong militarily, they are benefiting from a whole lot of new technological advances. The first one is the use of gunpowder as a weapon. Now, you might think, well, why didn't that help them, become stronger militarily? But first of all, gunpowder was originally discovered by a Taoist monk who was looking for a way to get everlasting life by mixing all of these elements, and he accidentally invented gunpowder, which then some people figured out that was good for making fireworks. To this day, the Chinese are well known for their fireworks. Then somebody figures out you could use it as a weapon. But if you look at this particular image, that looks like a giant freaking bottle rocket, because that's what it was. In other words, they're using it as a weapon, but basically what you're doing is shooting bottle rockets, giant bottle rockets, at the enemy. No one had seen such a thing before, but there is a question as to whether or not that's really effective. Another new advancement is movable type printing. And the variation of this actually came from India. But if you look at this image, what you will look at, if you can see it really closely, you have characters carved on these wooden blocks, and you can move the blocks around, add and subtract to create new pages. There was printing in India before this, but you would have to carve in everything on a single page on every single plate. With movable type, you can reuse and move around the Chinese character that you need. Um, Another new advancement is in naval technology, and this is something we're definitely going to come back to in the future because it's obviously a pretty big deal. Um, there, uh, Actually, there's a bunch of them. The compass is a big one. And the image you're looking at is actually the Chinese compass. And we're going to talk more about this later on, so I'm not going to go into much detail now. But I will point out one thing. The way that Chinese had their compasses set up is they pointed to the magnetic south, not the north. So they aligned themselves in a straight line the same. It's just they were looking south as opposed to north. There's another technique called the stern post rudder, which is used to steer big ships. Again, the naval technology is something we will definitely come back to shortly. So during the time of the song, there is so much production that some people have used the term proto industrialism. That is almost industrialism. If you remember, proto religion was a term that we used earlier in the year. It's not really industrialization, but it's so much economic output, manufacturing in particular, that it's kind of along similar lines. In terms of manufacturing, obviously silk has always been a big deal, but in the Song Dynasty, a technique to create a kind of porcelain that is kind of translucent that everybody in the world really wants. There's also new techniques for creating industries that had been around for a while, including iron. What you're looking at here is a pretty elaborate scheme. On the right, there's two guys that are blowing the billows to push oxygen underneath the fire, which is going to melt the ore, which then is dripping out sort of right in the middle of that page. And then it continues out into this flat area. And what those guys are doing with those long sticks are moving it around, and it's burning off some of the impurities. This is a process very much like what we'll see later on a larger scale called the puddling process, which, if you've studied the Industrial Revolution before, you might remember that was a really big deal for producing large amounts of iron. But the song had figured out a smaller scale version of how to do that way before everybody else. That manufacturing, that production then is also fostering an expansion in trade. And there's a whole lot of reasons why trade is expanding in the Song Dynasty. There's internal reasons, like, for example, the Grand Canal, allowing all sorts of goods and merchandise to move around within the empire itself, allowing it to then be traded outside of it. But another new innovation during this time is the development of paper money. Everybody's currency up until now had been primarily silver and gold, although in point of fact, early in its history in China, they used bronze. But what they come up with is a way to use paper to do this. And of course, the thing there is the paper itself has no intrinsic value. So this system only works if everybody agrees that that piece of paper is worth what people say that it is. By the way, I find this fascinating. The actual term that they used in the Song Dynasty translates as flying money. Um, we call it paper money, but in China it's called flying money. I just find that kind of interesting. Similarly, then, an early form of banking starts to emerge, which we would expect, right? If you've got paper money and everybody has to agree on the value of the paper that has no intrinsic value, there needs to be some sort of banking system that will ensure that the paper is worth what it's actually worth. Externally, though, there's an interesting development happening here. Whereas the Tang Dynasty was really focused on the Silk Roads, in the Song Dynasty, they are way more focused on trading in the Indian Ocean. Again, that power shift from the north to the south, a big reason for that is that the ports in the southern part of China have easier access to the Indian Ocean, which is ultimately where the Song Dynasty wants to go. All of this, though, raises a question. If this trade is expanding, it's blowing up, economic development happening during the Song Dynasty, what about the role of merchants? Because as you may recall, merchants are supposed to be at the bottom of the social hierarchy. They're mean people. They're people that don't value virtue, they value profit. And yet, more and more, they are becoming sort of like the cogs of the economic growth that's happening in the Song Dynasty. That's an interesting question that'll have ramifications throughout not just the near future, but the distant future in China. And so we'll come back to that later on. Here's the last thing I want to end on, though. A practice that emerges during the Song Dynasty called footbinding, okay? Now, I generally am not a proponent of showing pornography in videos on history, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do, okay? So here's the deal with footbinding. A little girl, as a child, her feet would be broken and then bound together in a certain way. This is sort of like if you took an x-ray of what's going on here. Now, the purpose for all of this, I'm sorry again, and guys, you might have to take a cold shower after this one. The purpose of all that is to create tiny little beautiful feet. I know that is so hot, isn't it? Look at that small little. Now, here's the thing. First of all, like this is the ultimate form of patriarchy, right? You're going to break your foot repeatedly for years and years and years to make this tiny little foot because some dudes think that's sexy. But here's the other thing about it. When you walk with your feet like that, it makes your hips sway in a certain ways, and the dudes just love that. And finally, do you think a woman whose foot is like that, both feet, can she run away from an abusive husband? Absolutely not. She can't run at all. This is all about patriarchy. Now, again, I don't mean to get like, too pornographic here, but if you take that shoe off and you take off that sock, this is what it looks like. I know it's hot, but hang in there. But I want to make sure you see what is going on here. This is the woman's left foot. That's her big toe. That's the second toe. The third, the fourth, that's her little pinky toe that over time is like bent into that. It's like malformed to create a almost like a high-heeled shoe. All right? Guys, what the heck is going on with this? Well, part of this has to do, many historians say, with a reassertion of Confucian patriarchy. As Buddhism is starting to spread, and we know that monasticism provides women an alternative, that this is a kind of a reassertion of the patriarchy associated with Confucianism, and I think there's some validity to that. It's obviously about controlling women. I mean, this is like one of the two most blatant examples of men controlling women's bodies to do something because they think it looks cool. But then it also, like I said, it creates a situation where that just puts the women more at the mercy of the men. In the case of China, the three men, the three obediences, their father, husband, and then oldest son. Like a woman whose feet are that malformed literally cannot run away. This is a really complex thing, and we're going to come back to it a few more times over the course of the next few weeks. But it's an unusual instance in the history of the world. Oh, one other thing I should mention about this was a practice for the upper class women. And it kind of makes sense, and it's something we haven't talked a whole lot about, but patriarchy seems to be stronger the higher up you go in the social order. And there's two reasons for that. Number one is if you are a lower class, working class woman, a peasant, you have to work because you've got to feed your family. And so, like, doing this dumb stuff, if you got to go out and work in a field every day, is ridiculous. But another aspect of it is in higher classes, women are more like trophies than they are like anything else. That they're literally just supposed to look pretty and impress other men because the dude can say, "Look at my wife. Look how small her feet are. I'm a good husband. Look at me." I know it's pretty nuts, but I believe that's part of what's going on. I want to thank you for paying attention. See you guys in class. Thanks.